Yeah, I recall Ray Baker saying, even in summer, chores began 'fore sunup back in those days. His dad farmed 200 acres down in south central Iowa, Ringgold County. He and Raymond did the whole thing with horses. One of Raymond's earliest memories was riding up in front of the wagon while his dad picked corn. I guess he felt like he was driving the team, but they knew what they were to do. Said his dad always kept a sharp eye for those show crop ears. Those he'd set aside for next year's seed. But no matter how good those kernels looked, you never knew what the next crop would yield. Farming corn was more in hard work and weather, and sure not scientific. A few years later, we were reading in Mr. Wallace's magazine about his experiments with hybrid corn. In 1926, Raymond was studying agronomy at the State College up in Ames. They held the annual Corn Day program at the Armory building, and folks came from all over. Raymond turned around, and there was Henry A. Wallace himself. And well, that's where it all began.
Just weeks after they met, Henry Wallace gave young Raymond Baker a small bag of his inbred corn and instructions on how to plant and detassel it. The resulting hybrid went on to win the Iowa Corn Yield State Championship the next year, with a previously unheard of 90 bushels to the acre.
Hello, I'm Robert Lindemeyer. I never got to meet Raymond Baker. He passed away in early 1999 at the age of 92. But I've spent more than a year learning about this extraordinary man by visiting with his family, his colleagues at Pioneer Hybrids, and his friends in the agronomy faculty here at Iowa State University. He's remembered today worldwide as one of the giants of the art and science of corn breeding. We have every reason to believe that the 1927 Blue Ribbon Hybrid was planted with this very planter. Here's how it works.
With every plunge and pull of the hand planter, a few kernels would drop and form the next hill. Hard work that took strong hands. Strong hands like those of the man who owned the planter, Raymond's father, Horace Baker. He and Raymond's mother, Nellie, lived and worked the family farm near Beaconsfield, Iowa, most of their adult lives. Horace, H.K. Baker, as everyone called him, and Nellie had been married at the turn of the century. Their son Raymond was born in 1906, and his sister Gladys several years later. This family portrait is from the early 1920s. And here's the Baker family farmstead in the 1940s, and as it exists today. We visited the farm with Raymond's eldest son, Lee Baker.
In the 30s, the drought killed maples that were enormous, huge, big maple grove back in here when my grandfather came in 98 or 100 or whatever.
So when Raymond tells you about coming home from Iowa State, he'd be coming home to this house.
Yes, and at that time, that road was not graveled. 1926 from Highway 2 wasn't here.
Yeah.
It was all mud, yellow clay mud. There's nothing like yellow clay mud. Your feet just get larger and larger and larger till you can't move them anymore. When I first came down here, this tree, none of this was as big as, we planted these trees. And the corn patch was, I think, in here.
Right here along this flat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're fortunate to have an interview with Raymond Baker made in 1987. He talks about that first meeting with Henry Wallace.
What I asked him was, could I buy a bushel or buy some of the corn to try on the farm in southern Iowa? And, well, he said didn't really have much to sell then. Of course, they were producing a little at that time. The Hybrid Corn Company had been organized in 1926. And, but he said what he would like to do would be to furnish me with some parent seed stock to produce a little experimental plot. And when I got down home, I told my father about what a wonderful thing it was going to be and how these hybrids were going to take over. And he wasn't very impressed. And when I told him that I wanted him to plant about 15 or 20 small samples of corn in an isolated field, he didn't think he was going to have time to do that. My mother went out with him in the field and helped plant the corn, so that it finally got planted all right, but probably wouldn't have been planted hadn't it been for her. Of course, I was home during the summer and was able to do the detasseling and also able to harvest the seed before I went back to Iowa State. So on the way back to Iowa State that fall, I stopped in to see him, and I was very enthusiastic. I had a list of 2 or 3 of the best ones, and he listened to me and finally said, well, I'm afraid the corn you produce down there this summer won't be of much value. I had that male on 2 or 3 hybrids this last year, and it just didn't yield. And so I doubt if it's worthwhile paying the entry fee to get them in the yield test. Well, of course, I was pretty disappointed about that. And I said, well, I had one there that I was particularly interested in, and I'd pay the entry fee on that. I think it cost $3 or something that way. I'd pay the entry fee to see that one got in. And when the yield tests were announced that winter, well, we'd won a gold medal with the 2 that he entered, and I got a bronze medal for the one in the district, and then we won the Banner Trophy for having the highest overall performance in the yield test.
This is the actual Certificate of Corn Productiveness and Blue Ribbon won by the Baker and Wallace hybrid, awarded February 1, 1928. That very spring, Henry Wallace persuaded young Raymond Baker to leave his studies at Iowa State College and come to work for Wallace's new venture, the Hybrid Corn Company. Raymond's first job? He was a hired hand to Mr. Wallace's tenant farmer, J. Newland.
Newland made an appointment with me, came up to Ames and talked to me a little, and so he offered me $80 a month and a gallon of milk a day. And so I accepted and started to work in March. I wasn't due to graduate until June, but I decided to skip that last quarter because I wanted to get in the seed corn business for while it was new and get in on the bottom ground. So at that time we were doing all our work with horses. And Newland was very proud of a 5-horse hitch with 2 horses out in front and 3 behind on a gang plow. And I was plowing this 40-acre field, which was to be our entire seed production for that year. And something happened, I don't know just why, the lead team slowed down, and one of the horses behind got his foot over the double tree, and away we went down across that field with all the horses at a gallop, and finally they got them stopped, but the harness was all broken up. One of the neighbors came over and and helped me kind of get them back together again. About that time, Newland showed up, and I fully expected to be fired, but he was pretty nice about it. He helped me get them lined up and get back to work.
Jay Newland and his new hired hand were working Wallace's 80-acre farm in the village of Johnston, Iowa, ground that even today is still part of what grew to become Pioneer Hybrid International. 65 years later, Jay Newland's son, Owen, would retire as senior vice president at Pioneer. We visited about Raymond Baker.
Can you recall Raymond Baker when you were a little boy being out there with your dad?
Oh, yes, I remember Raymond very much. I particularly remember him in the nursery. Right across the street here was the main nursery, corn breeding nursery for Pioneer. And Raymond, of course, in the summertime was always out there every day. And as a child, I was only there occasionally, but I certainly remember him there in his nursery with his, you know, they all wore a sort of an apron that had places for a stapler and places for small paper bags and places for whatever equipment they needed to make pollinations.
Raymond's son, Lee, pointed out the location of the nursery.
And this was high-lying poultry farms, and this was Father's watermelon patch, and my childhood home was in this area over in here. And you can't pull in there, unfortunately, but these blue spruces my father planted. That big old, our house was right in the center of here, and the big old maple tree we had a tire swing in. This was our home.
Throughout their long association, Raymond Baker and Henry Wallace shared a mutual fascination with the corn plant. The eldest of 6 children, Henry Agard Wallace, was born in 1888. He's shown here in about 1912 with his father, Henry C. Wallace, and his brothers, John and James. Henry C. was editor of the respected and popular agricultural newspaper, Wallace's Farmer. In 1921, Henry A. took over as editor of Wallace's Farmer and used the paper to promote his growing conviction in the potential of hybrid corn. In 1933, Henry Wallace accepted President Franklin D. Roosevelt's call to come to Washington as Secretary of Agriculture, and Raymond Baker assumed even greater responsibility at the growing seed corn company. A little over a year later, Wayne Skidmore, a young accounting graduate of Drake University, came to work at the Hybrid Corn Company. Today, at 90, he still drives to his office most days. Affectionately known to all as Skid, Wayne Skidmore rose to become president and CEO of Pioneer in 1965. He was relieved to get that first job because this was the mid-Depression.
Luckily, I was the one who got it, thanks to Nell Serban. So then I would get up in the morning and deliver the milk. The company milked 3 times a day, bottled the milk, and sold it to Hugh Morrison and his wife, who had a milk route in Des Moines, in the west side. I said the east side, the west side of Des Moines. Even some places I'd walk into the house and put the milk in the refrigerator in those days. Then I would come back at noon and keep the company books.
In 1933, Fred Lehman became president of the Hybrid Company when Henry Wallace left for Washington. Wayne Skidmore recalled Fred Lehman's annual review of Ray Baker's corn research budget.
Well, of course, each year, each department submitted their budget, and Raymond was always, I'd say, a conservative budget, but I don't ever remember his budget being cut, but I would suggest that maybe once in a while he was added to at Fred Lehman's assistance, because knowing Raymond, he knew that there was no extra baggage in the budget.
Severe drought in the mid-30s hit many corn farmers hard, but some of Ray Baker's hybrid research paid off with drought tolerance. The Hybrid Corn Company was on its way, as the demand for more of this seed set the stage for rapid acceptance of hybrid seed across the Corn Belt. Throughout his more than 50 years at Pioneer, Raymond Baker would be responsible for a number of important innovations in corn breeding and hybrid seed production, many of which continue today, like comparison test plots, cold germination testing, breeding for insect and disease resistance, and special mechanization like this cone planter. One of his first innovations was the idea of speeding up corn breeding by growing a winter generation in the southern hemisphere. Following the drought of 1934 and an early frost in 35, Henry Wallace and Raymond agreed to experiment with a winter crop in South America. Murray Bronner, one of Raymond's young corn breeders, was given the assignment to Argentina.
I'm interested in how you got selected, having only been with the company for 3 months,
Oh,
to be
well.
the guy to go to Argentina.
In some ways, I don't know now. In some ways, I was the only dude, I guess, around that was single. And I wanted to go. Then comes October 1st, and Raymond put me on an airplane headed for Washington, D.C. with my seed. In fact, I got the old trunk out here. And in that, I noticed that I had 200 or 300 samples of packages of inbred seed and very few closed. It was mainly seed.
Tell us about that trip on the Pan Am flying boat then. You left from Miami, right?
Of course, I was on an airplane. It was a little old airplane. It was, I think it was two-motored that I finally took. I think there would be room for, I don't remember now, 8 passengers, maybe like that, but it was amphibious, see. We would land, and anyway, that first night out, October 3rd, I spent that night in Haiti, Port-au-Prince, Haiti. And the second night in Antigua. And then I think the third night we hit Georgetown, British Guiana, on the coast of South America. And then Pará, Brazil, that's Belém, was the 4th day apparently, and that's right on the equator where I slept under the mesh. Fortaleza 5th, Salvador 6th, Rio de Janeiro 7th, Santos 8th, Porto Alegre 9th, Buenos Aires 10th.
With help from the U.S. Agricultural Attaché in Buenos Aires, Bronner arranged for a small plot at the Argentina Experiment Station near Pergamino.
My man that I had delegated to me to plant that first plot at Pergamino, he didn't know a word of English. And so with 2 stakes and a string, we would set, I don't remember, the 1 meter apart, I suppose, our rows, and at the other end, and I'd tell him move it over a little or get that and stretch the string. Now he'd make the furrow, and then with the hoe, and then I'd spread the seed, and then he'd cover it over, and we put it with just like you would a hoe.
By the end of the growing season in Argentina, Bronner had harvested his 3-acre plot.
When I was there by myself, I looked for a place that a dryer. I ended up by just kind of renting a room, a little old room of my landlady's, and I set up a fan, and an electric fan, and an electric heater and a fan. That's when I was there by myself. I looked for some place to dry it, but I didn't find it. But oh yes, on that way home by myself, I was concerned about my seed because drying it that way, I was afraid it wasn't dried thoroughly. And sure enough, when I got to Rio, I got permission to go down in the hold and look at my seed. And I had to aerate some of them down there when we were laying over in Rio de Janeiro. But the seed came back in good shape. in 1936.
By the 1940s, fully 100% of corn grown in the Midwest was hybrid corn, and the company was growing rapidly. Raymond Baker was always on the lookout for bright young corn breeders to join his staff. Retired pioneer corn breeder Stan Jensen was one of those who joined Raymond's group. We visited at York, Nebraska. In the early 1950s, Jensen was working on his master's degree at South Dakota State. His scholarship in corn breeding was funded by Pioneer Hybrids, and Ray Baker was obviously interested.
Well, he was interested in how the work was going, and he ended up coming up to see me and visiting with me about what we were learning in terms of drought tolerance.
Jensen has kept his letters from Ray Baker at that time.
This letter talks here about expanding the breeding operations in Nebraska, and is really asking if I might be interested in that position. Oh, he says here, and I remember writing this in my letter to him. He says, the fact that you particularly like to work with corn appeals to me. I feel that a real liking for corn is a very important requirement for a successful corn breeder.
But shortly thereafter, we have a letter that is obviously an offer of employment.
Right.
And how much was it they offered you?
Well, I think it was $325 a month, and then there was a little cost of living adjustment also. So it amounted to about $4,000 a year. We lived pretty well on that.
Bill Ambrose is another retired corn breeder who spent many hours in the test plots with the man he always called Mr. Baker. Today, Ambrose keeps the field book on his wife's hosta garden at their home in Urbandale. I've noticed as I visit with you about Raymond Baker, you always refer to him as Mr. Baker. Why is that, Bill?
I don't know. I was taught to refer to people older than I am with respect. So part of it was Mr. Baker was older than I am, and part of it was that he was just such a distinguished gent that he was always Mr. Baker and Dr. Brown was always Dr. Brown. That's just the way it was. Now, some that aren't much older than I am called him Raymond, but I felt very comfortable with the guy, talk about anything under the sun that you wanted to, so it wasn't a thing that there was a stiff relationship there, just had such a high level of respect that he had to be Mr. Baker in my mind. Whether he hired you or not, he was the great mentor around there. And so I think a long time from now, barring some cataclysmic event, why his management style still pervades that place. We tended to trust people. We tended to try to level people out. You know, those main really good things that he did just pervaded the whole society. So yeah, he hired a lot of people, as you say, just because he was there so long. But beyond that, he really had an impact. And everybody knew that he was just uncanny in his understanding of the organism.
Ambrose talked about the southern corn leaf blight that swept through most of the U.S. corn crop in 1970.
The Texas southern leaf blight, race T, produced a toxin that just made the plants whizen down. You know, the tops would bow over, and it didn't die great. Of course, it died earlier than it should, and it just secondary organisms moved in after that and turned the thing black. So it just looked bad. That was the most grave I've ever seen Mr. Baker. I wouldn't say scared would be the word, but just great. It was like there was a battle in a war getting ready to go on, and everybody knew that they had to do their work to the best of their ability, and maybe somewhat beyond that, or it wasn't going to come out very well. And I don't remember how he said it, but he let us know that it could be all over if we don't figure out how to deal with this organism that's doing such a drastic thing to the crop.
Dr. Don Duvik became director of corn research when Raymond Baker retired from Pioneer in 1971. When first hired, Duvik researched male plant sterility.
I was given the assignment of developing this new method of producing hybrid seed without detasseling, what was called cytoplasmic male sterility. And it involved doing some genetics, because not too much was known about it, and then eventually fairly routine breeding. So that was my job for several years.
No detasseling required.
Not exactly none, but at least it was reduced. And then ultimately, when the breeding was done in a specific way, you could produce a hybrid without any detasseling at all.
But in 1970 came the southern corn leaf blight.
Well, that was the sad ending to that story, that in 1970, a variation of a common disease called southern corn leaf blight, a variant appeared which was specific to the particular breeding that was used to make one kind of cytoplasmic male sterility. And it was devastating in some parts of the country. In fact, I can remember one afternoon with him, we were looking at some field south of Ames, and it looked as though corn that was not the cytoplasmic male sterile corn, in other words, the old-fashioned normal type, it looked as though that also had the disease. And theoretically, it could have spread to that type of corn. And I remember Raymond saying, this may be the end of corn for the U.S. Now, fortunately, in that one case, he was wrong, but theoretically, he could have been right.
Professor of genetics at Washington University in St. Louis, Dr. Edgar Anderson was Duvik's major professor and a consultant to Pioneer and Raymond Baker's research program.
I think one of the reasons he got interested in what Anderson was doing is that Anderson was looking at the origins of the Midwestern Corn Belt dent corn. The theory was maybe if you could identify those old parents more precisely, you could identify higher yielding hybrids more precisely. What turned out the theory, although it was right, it wasn't really strong enough to do us much good, but that was the sort of thing that aroused Raymond's interest. And as a matter of fact, Bill Brown did some very careful work along that line in some years after he had joined Pioneer.
Also a student of Edgar Anderson, Bill Brown was the first PhD geneticist Raymond hired at Pioneer. Raymond always said he'd make a corn breeder of Bill Brown one day. This snapshot was taken in 1984, the year Brown retired. He served as president and CEO of Pioneer in the late 70s. Duvik talked about the Baker and Brown relationship.
The two of them, I think, always had a great deal of mutual respect, and although Bill's interests in certain ways were different from Raymond's, they understood how complementary these interests were, and in either case put that complementarity to work probably for the betterment of the company, at least for better corn breeding.
Bill Brown, like Ray Baker and Henry Wallace, had developed an abiding interest in the history of corn. In 1956, Brown and Wallace co-authored Corn and Its Early Fathers. Revised by Brown in 1988 to include a chapter on Wallace, the book remains today an important resource. Dr. Arnell Hallauer, Distinguished Professor of Agriculture and Director of the Baker Plant Breeding Center at Iowa State, recalled being interviewed by Ray Baker in the spring of 1954.
I was an undergraduate at that point, at Kansas State in Manhattan, Kansas. Well, I didn't want to encourage him too much because I knew I had to go in the service because the Korean conflict was going hot and heavy at the time. And but he says, well, let's just come up and look at it and visit. So a little later in the spring, he provided for me to ride a train from Manhattan to Kansas City and Kansas City to Des Moines. And so I visited them out at Johnston, Iowa, the group that he had there, and I enjoyed it. And I was very excited about, the possibilities. And he never mentioned anything to me about it. Well, I had to go into service, and I was in there then until sometime in about August 1956, I guess it was. Well, sometime not long afterwards, then I heard from Mr. Baker again that he said, hey, I still got the possibility of positions here if you want to work for me. And I says, well, golly, I would have been interested, but I just accepted an assistantship from a guy named Dr. Sprague at Ames. Oh, him. He says, by all means, go there. He says, that's to your advantage. Dr. Sprague and Mr. Baker were very close. They were interchanging materials, discussed different ideas, expressed their experiences on what had been successful and what had not been successful. When I was a graduate student here, he invited us down, Mr. Baker, to visit Pioneer out at Johnson, their breeding facilities. We'd spend a whole day going through nurseries, discussing things. Mr. Baker, one time we were all there, he had about 10 hybrids lined up there, and he wanted us to rate them as to what we thought were the best hybrids. This was in, say, September. Okay. And they were very attractive-looking hybrids, so he wanted us all to go through their graduate students and rate them. Well, we finally went, it was like, judging cattle at the fair or something or other, so we did that and handed them in, and he looked at it and kind of laughed and says, well, you rated them the same way my salesman did. And he says, I'll tell you which ones are the highest yielding. They weren't about reverse of what we had thought. And he was pointing out to us, that what was confounding what we thought was high yielding was that some had large shanks on them, which is the attachment at the butt of the ear to the plant. And if you have a long shank, that ear was laying out there and flopping over, and boy, oh boy, you thought you had a lot of corn there, when really that one that had a very short shank and set kind of upright on the ear, or on the plant, it was the highest yielding. So he did try to educate us on things like that as well.
Tell me about that logbook you've got there in your lab.
Well, this book is the original nursery of the corn breeding program. In 1922, Merle Jenkins started the breeding program here at Iowa State College, or Iowa State University, and it was the first season that we had a corn breeding program in Iowa. Oh, here, Baker 164 was the male pollinator hybrid that won the Banner Trophy in 1927 and 1928. Wallace renumbered 461 to B164. It was back, in 1931, but Mr. Baker was talking to me with this. I was visiting with him about this book in 1973.
That's where it all began.
It all began, yeah. It's amazing. And it all began there, and it continued for 60 years. That's the amazing thing.
During July, corn breeders spend long hours in the nursery. Professor Hallauer provided some comparisons to Ray Baker's time.
Well, this is our equipment that corn breeders primarily use. It consists of what we call pollinating aprons with different pockets on it to hold different supplies. In those days, they tend to use kind of a canvas-type apron, rather than this kind of a plastic, which is lighter. It doesn't absorb water like those old pollinating aprons you used to use. And, of course, they're easier to fasten here at the back because there's a snap here. Before, we had a string that we had to tie, and quite often you get a knot in it or something or other and have difficulties getting it off or something like that.
Dr. Hallauer advised that this was the 78th continuous year for the corn breeding nursery at Iowa State.
While we're going over the breeding nursery, incidentally, this is what we call a crossing block. What you see in here, you see very different lines from row to row, and it's different characteristics of the inbred lines. Each inbred line has its own very unique phenotype. You see that line there is quite different from the one where my hand is here on the right. And again, we'll make crosses between them. And then next year when we grow the hybrid, it'll look like neither one of the parents. it'll be more vigorous and taller and so forth.
Next, Dr. Hallauer demonstrated hand cross-pollination.
We'll take these tassels down and we hit it, smack it to shake the pollen loose from the anthers. There's generally plenty of pollen. It's been estimated there'll be anywhere from 10 to 25. Then I find my shoot that I want to pollinate, and let's find one here in the end. Here, this is one that's not cut, but I want to pollinate that and see the nice silk there. And so then I pour the pollen on. See, there's plenty of pollen there. I call it the old Iowa gold. Then I cover it up right quickly. I want to do those actions and operations as quickly and swiftly as I can. Again, minimize pollination. Now, I've crossed that plant with this one down here. That'll be a cross-pollination. That bag will stay there till harvest.
And the good old hand planter.
And this is the type of planters that Mr. Baker started out with. And we used these until about 1970 quite extensively. It's what we call a hand jabber. You drop the grain in here at the top in the funnel, and then you jab it in the ground, cover it with your foot, jab it in the ground. And people got quite expert at this, and I expect Mr. Baker is one of the best ones around because you plant enough and you get a certain amount of rhythm in there, and you drag your foot to cover it, and you just keep it going, and you have to drop a seed in each time. And that was how we planted everything. So corn breeders, they may have tennis elbows, but it's not from playing tennis, it's from jabbing corn planters back in the older days. But this is all, again, very much similar to what Mr. Baker had grown up doing through his years at breeding at Pioneer, only he'd be on a larger scale. But the breeding part of it would be essentially the same as this. Single row, progenies, go through, make selections, make pollinations, and then select again at harvest, advance those ears, and then put them in what we call a test cross to find out how it yields. And 99.9% of them are thrown away. The odds are about 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 100,000 that we'll find a line in here that'll have some use. So that's kind of the odds we're playing. And so the chances of developing something that's really like a B73 or a B37 or something like that, Missouri 17, Ohio 43, pretty slim. And if your goal as a plant breeder is to develop a line, well, you've got to be persistent at it over time, which is what Mr. Baker was for 60 years. That's how he did it. He was just persistent and kept recycling and making those incremental improvements so that he and his colleagues and the people he directed were able to develop these superior lines to make the superior hybrids.
After almost 20 years as a corn breeder at Pioneer, Dr. Forrest Troyer joined DeKalb Pfizer in 1977 and rose to become Vice President for Research and Development. Although now retired, he continues his corn research and serves as adjunct professor of crop science at the University of Illinois.
Forrest, your years of working with Ray Baker and later doing research at Pfizer give you a unique perspective on Ray Baker's contributions to the profession.
Yes, as you know, I've felt very highly. I had a great love for Mr. Baker as a father figure and an older brother, and in a short length of time, I don't suppose I was with the company more than a few months, certainly not more than a year. I realized that he had thought about, at some length of time, for about everything in corn breeding that there was to think about. He was just an excellent source of information on any question that you had. He had a reason for doing the things that he was doing in corn breeding. He did not require that you do the same things that he did in corn breeding, but he'd probably tell you the reasons why he was doing what he was doing. I even had if possible, I even had a higher esteem for him. After I left, I realized what an important part of the foundation that he was there at Pioneer. In general, why a research approach was used on a lot of questions. If there was something they didn't know what to do, they might try 2 or 3 things on a small scale and then follow on. And I think that traced back to Mr. Baker.
Did you maintain a friendship with Raymond after you left and went to Pfizer?
Oh, yes. We exchanged Christmas cards, at least a few letters.
I would stop by and see him. There was a thing or two that happened at Pioneer that seemed impossible to me, and I could hardly sleep without knowing more about them. And I had a reason to go to Nebraska, and instead of flying, I drove, and I spent the evening with Raymond and Mary. And when I did visit Raymond, why, it was just like I'd never left. You know, that there wasn't any. Although on a time or two he asked me a question or two that he was curious about what somebody else was doing, and I answered him just like I had never left, you know.
Dr. Ron Cantrell, Director General of the International Rice Research Institute, talked about Ray Baker's research team.
I've always had a lot of admiration for the plant breeding group that he put together at Pioneer. Obviously, they were successful in developing germplasm, but the reason was that he identified good people, and he nurtured their careers, and they stuck around a long time. And he gave them lots of freedom. And so myself being involved in research management, I've always thought, boy, that's the way to do it, you know. So I feel like I've learned something from Ray, and because he built an outstanding research organization.
Again, Owen Newland.
It's clear that Raymond made a tremendous contribution to Pioneer, but he also made a tremendous contribution to agriculture, not only the U.S. agriculture, but world agriculture. Just the fact that he mentored all of these breeders. And corn yields, you know, went from, in the 30s, from about an average of 30 bushels an acre. They're now up to, on the average in the U.S., somewhere maybe 140. And when he retired, as I recall, probably 25% of the corn planted in the U.S. had been developed under his leadership.
Like other members of the Pioneer Board, Ray Baker became a leader in the Johnston, Iowa community. We visited the Baker home there with Lee Baker.
The front porch wasn't glassed in or wasn't contained, and the house actually stopped there where the brick starts.
Right.
That was the back steps going in.
Let's walk over here and tell me about the bomb shelter or whatever you call it here.
I think that was Father's place to store roots and a place to get to in case we had a tornado, and it was also the well is there. It kept his pump from freezing, and it was a good place to put the eggs and the garden produce and so forth.
But your dad built it, you say?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
We dug it by hand. Well, we didn't dig the well. We dug the hole around it by hand. I think Father did most of the work, and Larry and I threw dirt at each other.
Here's a snapshot of Lee and his younger brother, Larry, with Raymond and Mildred in about 1945. Lee also remembered how he and Larry helped their father with his hobby of watermelon breeding.
At night when we came home from school, we got to sample, and then on Saturdays, Dad would have anyone who wanted to come and taste watermelons, and we would cut the watermelons in half, you know, lengthways, and then just run your fingers down those seed veins, and then all the seeds came out, and then you tasted one small piece of watermelon. Well, every one you tasted, you had to put down the quality, and was it ripe or green or whatever, and what the quality of the meat was and how it tasted. And after the first 4 or 5 were real good, and from then on they got the taste quality went down precipitously.
And here's the family again in 1952. Lee was in the Marine Corps, and Larry was a student at Iowa State. Larry went on for a Ph.D. in statistics at the University of Minnesota and built a very successful career in computer systems at Pioneer and later in California. At the age of 49, he died from injuries received in a fall. Recently, his widow, Norma Baker, made a $10 million gift to establish the Lawrence H. Baker Center for Bioinformatics and Biological Statistics at Iowa State University in Larry's memory. His son Joe was 24 when Larry died.
At that point, Grandpa took it upon himself to be kind of a father. And we traveled a lot together and had a lot of fun, and I learned a lot more about Pioneer and how much he cared about it.
Joe commented on a snapshot of he and his grandfather Raymond.
It was taken a couple of weeks after we moved back to Iowa. He was mildly amazed that I moved back to Iowa and absolutely delighted. And he spent most of his time trying to teach me what other people assumed I already knew because I was his grandson. I had never planted a thing in my life growing up in Los Angeles.
And remembered how Raymond loved to study the corn.
I just remember coming back to town and catching up with Grandpa in the cornfield. Whenever there was corn out, even now with the corn very short, he'd be out tromping around, keeping an eye on it. And he loved it. He just, you couldn't hardly keep him out of it. Had to be an awful good reason for him to skip a day in the cornfield.
Just 2 blocks north of the Baker home on Merle Hay Road stands the Johnston Lions Club Community Building. We visited there with Merton Hansen about one of the club's charter members, Raymond Baker, and the fund drive for the new building.
A couple of us visited with Raymond and convinced him that he should go help us on the first amount. And he agreed to match the first $50,000 we could raise, so we got busy in a hurry. It is very busy. If you want to use it on a weekend during the summer, you have to get a year ahead reservation for, we have it full all summer for weddings and parties like that.
In the early 1960s, St. Paul Presbyterian was looking for a location for a new church, and Ray Baker had a 5-acre lot just south of his home on Merle Hay Road. Mert Hansen was a member of the search committee.
We went to Raymond because it looked like a nice piece of property and right on the main highway. But then we went to the congregation, presented them with 3 pieces of property, and Raymond wouldn't set a price on his, but the other people had. And we told them if his was higher, we'd come back to him if they selected it. Well, they selected his, then we went to Raymond to get a price. And to our surprise, he said, well, $1 be too much. And it was very much appreciated. He had a couple stipulations. He says, Mert, he says, would it be all right if I said that they shouldn't have a driveway on my side?
Ray and Mary Baker were active supporters of Variety Clubs International. Chairman of the Variety Club's board, Michael Riley, reflected on that support.
Maybe one of the greatest gifts the Bakers have given us, because they have given, and they've given quietly, which was a style at Raymond and Mary Baker's all their lives, to be very quiet humanitarians. And we have a saying that you never stand so tall as when you stoop to help a child. And the Bakers really have, they're giants in my mind.
Raymond returned to his alma mater in 1935 to finish his bachelor's degree in agronomy, and throughout his life demonstrated his affection for Iowa State. Distinguished Professor of Agronomy at Iowa State, Ken Fry, reflected on Raymond's support of the Plant Science Lecture Series.
I said, we're trying to develop this more extensively now, and we need to have more money to do it. I said, we have $45,000 left from the Crops Congress, or the Plant Breeding Congress, and we honestly need $100,000 to do it. And I was about ready to say, we'd like to get half of it from you, and he didn't even let me. He says, well, I think I can handle that.
In 1991, Iowa State University awarded Raymond Baker the Honorary Doctorate of Humane Letters, the first such degree given in 26 years.
I don't think there's anybody who was ever as proud as he and Mary were the day that he got his honorary doctorate from Iowa State.
Raymond's grandson, Joe, attended the commencement.
Most of us were there. We had all heard the stories of Grandpa. Iowa State had tried, I think, for a couple of years to give Grandpa an honorary degree, and he felt uncomfortable, I think, accepting one because he hadn't earned it. And he also, one of the stipulations he made is that he wouldn't have to give a speech. And I think it was partially he was not terribly fond of public speaking, but he also told Bob Watson at Iowa State that he thought all those kids were more interested in graduating. They didn't want to listen to him. And but he did enjoy it. And I think the day, seeing a lot of his old friends, a lot of the Iowa State professors, made him feel awful good.
Bob Watson, Senior Development Officer for the ISU Foundation.
But I met Raymond and Mary through my role with the foundation. I guess I met them in the late 80s, mid to late 80s.
You know, it's no secret that with Pioneer's phenomenal growth and success, Raymond Baker became a very wealthy man. How was he affected by that wealth?
Bob, Raymond, and Mary were the most modest, most humble, most thoughtful, most honest. They're among the very few in that area of just being very plain, kind, thoughtful people. And you would never, ever guess that they had any wealth at all. They did not wish to show off in any way their assets. What they wanted to do was help people and help organizations. He wanted to help Iowa State. He wanted no credit for it. He wanted to do things for Iowa State he could not possibly identify completely, and he left a lot to the university to decide. He gave gifts to where the need was greatest, because he wasn't sure what all these needs were. Obviously, he was very fond of agronomy and very supportive of agronomy. But he was just a very, very thoughtful man, Bob, very thoughtful.
Recently, Iowa State dedicated a new center for plant breeding to Raymond Baker. Martin Jiske, then president of the university, made the announcement.
Ray Baker was indeed a most remarkable person. Today, Iowa State is embarking on a major new initiative in plant sciences, thanks in part to the generous support of Raymond Baker. It is very appropriate that the plant breeding center of this initiative be dedicated in his memory.
Just before the dedication ceremonies, the Baker family gathered for a brief photo opportunity. Joe Baker spoke about his grandfather.
The Baker family has felt like investors in Iowa State for a long time, and for the past few years we feel we've seen tremendous gains up here. We're also very lucky that Henry Wallace and Jay Newland didn't take Grandpa seriously when he said he enjoyed his job so much that he would have paid them for the opportunity to do it.
Raymond Baker continued his corn research for more than 25 years after his official retirement. Henry Wallace retired here at Farview Farm in Westchester County, New York. He maintained his interest in corn breeding, corresponding often with Raymond Baker. His health failing from Lou Gehrig's disease, this is his last letter to Raymond.
Dear Raymond, your 3306 has me all excited. So glad you have 2,000 acres of it. Did both sides tassel together? How is the kernel type on the female? How far north will it go? How far south? What does the MM1 yield? I was feeling rather blue when I got up this morning, thinking the end of the road was not far off. But when I got to thinking about 3306, I felt I just had to live. Yes, this is about the most exciting letter I ever received from you. Thanks so much for your letter. Yours, Henry A.
Henry Wallace died less than 3 months later and was buried here in Glendale Cemetery in Des Moines. He and Raymond Baker had created an industry that has made the world a better place for us all. On March 15, 1999, only 2 months after Raymond Baker had passed away, Pioneer Hybrid International announced it was merging with DuPont. The $7.7 billion deal paid Pioneer shareholders $40 per share. Newspapers suggested the Baker estate had more than doubled. Raymond F. Baker will forever be remembered as a true pioneer of the art and science of corn breeding. He dearly loved to walk the corn.